My name is Avery Cole, I'm 34, and I make my living bringing other people's brands to life. I never imagined the ugliest thing ever said about mine, my own, would be spoken into a crystal flute over dry-aged ribeye and candlelight. It happened at my mother's 58th birthday, in a private room overlooking the Chicago River, where the napkins matched the orchids and every chair scrape echoed money. Mom, Evelyn Cole, immaculate as always, rose to thank the guests. Laughter softened, glassware stilled, and I followed the sparkle at her wrist as she lifted her champagne. "You know what I want more than anything," she said, smiling like a hostess on a magazine cover. "For Avery to finally leave my life." The room went quiet enough to hear the river below. 15 faces turned toward me, as if I were the loud thing in the room, not her sentence. My throat closed. I'd spent weeks planning this night, months paying for it, years trying to be someone she could be proud of, and she chose that moment to make my existence sound like a stain on her tablecloth. I didn't walk out. I watched. I listened. And for the first time in my life, I decided to give my mother exactly what she asked for, just not the way she meant. If you've ever stood in a room full of people and felt completely alone, tell me where you're watching from, and hit subscribe so you don't miss what comes next. Because the gift she demanded that night, I wrapped it differently, and when she opened it, she was the one who had to leave. I grew up in a brick two-story in Oak Park, just west of downtown Chicago, where the wind could rattle the storm windows even in April, and the maple in the backyard dropped leaves like confetti every October. My dad, Henry, was an architect who could glance at a crooked picture frame and fix it so it hung true. He'd hold my sketches up to the kitchen light and say, "You see the story before the lines, kiddo. That's a gift." He smelled like cedar shavings and coffee. When I was 12, a heart attack stole him from a Saturday morning and turned our house into a museum of rules. My mother, Evelyn, worked her way up to regional operations at a major bank on LaSalle. She never let you forget it. If Dad's love was scaffolding, Mom's love was inspection. There was always a clipboard somewhere, even when there wasn't. After the funeral, neighbors brought casseroles and stories. Mom brought a schedule. "We honor your father by keeping standards," she told me, sliding a laminated chart onto the fridge. "Wake at 6 a.m., bed at 9:30, piano 30 minutes, homework 2 hours, chores in between." Grief was a line item. If I cried, she handed me tissues with 2 fingers, the way you hand a stranger a receipt. The house itself felt split in 2. The front rooms with the antiques and the good rugs were for guests. We lived in the back, where she could see the kitchen counters from her desk and the laundry room from the sink. I learned to walk quietly, to lay pencils down instead of letting them roll. "Details," she'd say, tapping a measuring cup against the counter. "Details tell the world who you are." In middle school, I loved art class with the kind of loyalty you give a person who saved you. I stayed late to help wash brushes, volunteering to paint the backdrop for the spring concert. Mom met me by the office, heels clicking across linoleum, eyes already scanning for infractions. "Clubs are for kids who don't have a plan," she said, holding out my coat. "Your priority is grades." The next day, she emailed the principal about the hazards of solvent in the art room. Our teacher swapped to water-based paints, a small thing, but it taught me who could change a room without raising her voice. People noticed our house after Dad died. Realtors left cards in our mailbox. Aunt Diane called it prime, a word that glinted. Dad had left a clear will. The house and his life insurance to be shared between his wife and his only child, me. "Joint," he'd said once, showing me a schematic for a porch addition. Index fingers stained graphite gray. Means together. By the time I was old enough to understand bank statements, joint meant something else. My name printed on an account my mother controlled. She framed it as love. "You're too young to manage a lump sum," she'd say. "We'll use it responsibly. Your father would expect prudence." Prudence bought my mother suits that fit like they'd been poured on and a second kitchen renovation, complete with a 6-burner range. No one was allowed to splatter. Prudence did not pay for my AP art fees without a conversation. "You can't seriously expect me to subsidize a hobby," she said when I hesitated to ask. "What about debate team?" I started mowing neighbors' lawns to cover what felt like my own guilty pleasures. Canvas, charcoal, A used DSLR I hid under my bed in a shoebox labeled winter scarves. There were 1,000 small memories that pried under the skin and stayed. A classmate's birthday sleepover I wasn't allowed to attend because unstructured environments breed poor decisions. A new white blouse she ironed for me. The hiss of steam like a threat, and the way she lifted an eyebrow when she caught me looking at the tiny threadbare patch near the cuff. If you're observant enough to notice flaws, you're accountable for fixing them. I kept a diary in a sketchbook, not because I had secrets, but because the paper felt like listening. She found it behind my roller skates. "What do you suppose is healthy about fixating on hurt?" she asked, flipping to a page where I'd drawn a crooked heart. That night, I slipped the sketchbook into a grocery bag with some old magazines and dropped it in the alley bin behind the library, like disposing of contraband. High school was a course in comparative worth. The names floated through the kitchen with the smell of lemon cleaner and roast chicken. Sabrina's daughter landed an early acceptance to Northwestern. Pre-med. You know the Miller boy? Stanford. Full ride. Why don't you try for something serious, Avery? I made straight A's. Captained yearbook. Won a statewide poster competition. Nice, Mom said, tongue on the edge of the word. Now broaden your extracurriculars. When I added volunteer hours at a nonprofit gallery in Pilsen, she said, "It's fine to dabble with charities, but your resume needs heft." Everything I did was a prelude to whatever she thought I should have done next. My memory of Dad had to work hard to breathe and all that. Some nights I would sit on the back steps and imagine him leaning against the door jamb, sleeves rolled, nodding at the sky, as if it had done a decent job. He told me once that buildings are compromises. You push against what's there, he said, tapping a foundation with the toe of his boot. But the ground always speaks back. The trick is learning the dialogue. With Mom, there wasn't dialogue. There were directives. When I pushed, she spoke louder. I got into the University of Illinois, at Chicago, with a partial scholarship for design. I showed her the letter in the dining room, under the chandelier that only lit for holidays and company. UIC, she said, smile small and tight. You could aim higher. Did you even try for Northwestern? I told her about the portfolio, the professor who'd called my work narrative-driven. She slid the letter back across the table. Narratives don't pay mortgages. I paid the enrollment deposit with money from an envelope I'd labeled in pencil and hidden behind the HVAC filter in the basement, tips from a summer job at a cafe on Lake Street, and a handful of cash I'd made photographing graduation parties for cousins and their friends. The summer after freshman year, she suggested I move back home to save on housing while I looked for internships. It made financial sense, and it made invisible chains. Temporary, she said, like a promise. It stretched into 6 years that looked like strategy and felt like detention. My studio desk sat under the attic eaves, slanted ceiling, low window onto the maple. The house was convenient for client meetings and wildly inconvenient for privacy. If my phone rang and I took the call in my room, she'd pause in the hallway with a dish towel in her hand and say, "Projecting confidence is part of business. Speak up or step outside." When I left for coffee with friends, she asked, "Who exactly?" When I delayed answering a text, she'd say, "You ignore phones like your father ignored invoices." Dating inside that weather system felt like asking someone to picnic in a wind tunnel. The first person I introduced to her was Evan, a civil engineer who said please to servers and helped my neighbor change a tire one icy March. He came for dinner and complimented her cocoa vin, which was truly perfect, and mentioned his parents owned a small hardware store in Joliet. "Blue collar," she said, nodding like she was assessing a specimen. "Solid work ethic. But long-term upward mobility can be tricky without higher education in the family." Evan's cheeks went blotchy. He left early. He ghosted me after a week. When I asked her why she couldn't just be kind, she said, "You're too sensitive. I'm simply honest. You'll thank me when you're older." Another time, with a teacher I was entirely too attached to, Gabe, who loved Frank Lloyd Wright, and once said my compositions breathed like rooms, she scanned his shoes and asked, "What's your 5-year plan outside of grading?" He smiled, but later told me he didn't want to be re-interviewed every time we crossed the threshold. I learned to keep my heart in my chest, where she couldn't audit it. Money threaded through everything. My father's insurance, the house, a joint account with my name on it, and her hand on the tap. If I needed a new laptop, there was an interrogation. How many billable hours will this purchase produce? If I asked about the balance, she handed me a pie chart printout that would have made a mutual fund manager proud. Household expenses, taxes, maintenance, long-term investments. There was always a sliver labeled Avery. It felt like an allowance, like proof I required care rather than that I owned anything. Once, after a good quarter, I withdrew $600 to pay for a typography workshop taught by a designer whose book I kept next to my bed. She called me into the kitchen and set the bank notification on the counter between us like evidence. You took from our future to subsidize playtime, she said. That money is for the roof fund. The markets are volatile. You don't have a husband. I put the receipt in my pocket where it cut my thigh, like folded tin. If you've never lived with someone who polishes you like a surface, you don't know what it means to be tired without being sleepy. The house gleamed. The mirrors told on you. If my posture dipped at the table, she'd tap a teaspoon against her water glass. If a friend dropped by unannounced, she'd switch to a pleasant voice sharp as a new knife. Avery was just about to declutter her desk. Drop in again, won't you? If I got a magazine mention, up-and-coming designer to watch. She read it, nodded, and left it in a neat stack of mail I needed to recycle. College graduation was a sunburned June afternoon on the UIC quad. Mortarboards bobbing, new sandals blistering heels. I scanned the folding chairs, found her at the end of a row. Hair perfect, smile camera ready. Congrats, she said, quick as a courtesy. What's your plan to avoid moving home permanently? I told her about the freelance clients I'd lined up, the internship at a boutique agency in River North. Internship, she repeated, as if she were tasting something sour. You'll be 30 and still interning if you're not careful. Around us, families hugged like they were trading oxygen. I folded my program until the paper softened and gave way. Back home that summer, she insisted on reviewing my contracts. You'll be eaten alive, she said, red penciling hourly rates, while the evening news murmured about interest hikes and layoffs. She was good at spotting traps. She was also good at confusing caution with control. You need a professional image, she said, ordering me a set of business cards embossed with a serif font that looked like a law firm's. Sans serif is warmer. I tried. Warmth doesn't pay invoices, she said, which became our tiny family proverb. Trust eroded in increments. She began checking in with my roommates when I lived briefly near campus, calling if I didn't answer by the third ring. Safety, she said. She opened my mail to speed bill paying, then left envelopes on my pillow with post-its call. She'd stand in my doorway at midnight because she thought she'd heard the back gate. We live in the world we live in, she'd say if I flinched. The world we lived in was one where the front door deadbolt clicked at 9 o'clock, and my passwords changed quarterly. Hers too, but somehow she always knew mine. Once, when I cleared my browser history, she said, people who erase are people who hide. And for the first time, I wondered which one of us believed that harder. It wasn't all thunder. There were days when she'd bring home pastries from a French bakery downtown, set them on a plate like offerings. She'd ask about a project and actually listen for a minute. We laughed sometimes, like two people in a story who might be friends if they hadn't been cast as mother and daughter in this version of the script. Then the laughter would catch on a snag, an image I'd chosen, a price I'd quoted and tear. The next morning she'd wipe the counters and firm, even strokes as if the shine could make last night's words untrue. Years layered like vellum. You could see through each to the one below. The pattern repeated: achievement, correction, boundary, audit, hope, adjustment. If any of this rings true to you, I'm listening in the comments. But the important thing is this. By the time you hear the sentence that breaks you, it's not a surprise so much as a thesis finally stated out loud. My life with Evelyn trained me to sit very still and notice what hurts. It also trained me to build something out of noticing. By the time I was in my mid-20s, the scaffolding of my life looked sturdy from the outside, but felt like a rickety fire escape under my feet. My career as a designer wasn't handed to me. It was carved one invoice at a time. Clients rarely knocked on my door. I chased them through Craigslist ads, networking events where the coffee was burnt, and cold emails that too often sat unopened. While my peers in finance and law had clear ladders to climb, I was building mine rung by rung with duct tape and grit. Every choice cost something. Rent downtown would have meant independence, but I chose the attic at my mother's because it saved money. I swallowed my pride each time I explained to friends that yes, I still lived at home, because every month that passed meant another few $100s tucked away for software, a new lens, a down payment someday. I made do with a 10-year-old car whose heater coughed more than it warmed, because upgrading meant delay in my dream of financial footing. Meanwhile, my mother's life seemed to flow downhill without resistance. Her promotions came like clockwork, each one announced at family gatherings with a toast she encouraged others to give. She redecorated the living room twice in 5 years, flew first class to a banking conference in Miami, and never hesitated to spend 4 figures on a handbag, because quality is an investment. My own laptop, my livelihood, was questioned as a luxury. The contrast gnawed. In relationships, I sacrificed more than I admitted, even to myself. There was Caleb, a fellow designer I met at a gallery opening. We spent nights sketching side by side, trading critiques like secrets, but he couldn't understand why I avoided bringing him home. When I finally did, Mom asked about his 5-year plan before she asked his name again. Later that night, she said, "Don't anchor yourself to someone unproven." Caleb drifted soon after. I told myself it was timing, but I knew better. Professionally, I turned setbacks into lessons the hard way. I once lost a branding contract to a larger agency, only to find out they plagiarized elements of my pitch. My mother's response, "That's the business world. Grow a thicker skin." I didn't cry. I redesigned my portfolio until 3 in the morning, adjusting every pixel so the next pitch would be bulletproof. The victory came slowly. A Chicago coffee chain hired me for a full rebrand. I spent sleepless weeks sketching logos, testing color palettes, driving to each location to see how signage caught the light. When they unveiled the new look, sales rose 20%. For me, it was proof I wasn't just dabbling. Yet when I told Mom, she shrugged. "Maybe now you can afford to move out." But I didn't. Not yet. Instead, I sacrificed weekends for freelance gigs, photographing weddings, designing posters for community theaters, anything that added to my portfolio. I ate ramen while she dined at steakhouses. I wore thrift store coats while she came home with Nordstrom bags. Each sacrifice was a wager that someday, somehow, she would look at me and see not a disappointment, but a daughter worth respecting. It's strange how sacrifices shape you. They make you resourceful, yes, but also weary. I learned to do without praise, to work in silence, to clap for myself when no one else did. I saved, I hustled, I endured, and all the while, I told myself it was building toward a moment when the balance would tip, when she would finally acknowledge that I wasn't a child under her roof but an adult holding my own. That belief kept me moving, even when the weight of it bent me double. The night that shattered everything began like a dream I had rehearsed for years. My mother's 58th birthday was supposed to be my moment, the one where sacrifice became recognition. I had booked a private room at an upscale Italian restaurant along the Chicago River, a place she had once sighed about when passing in a cab, saying, "That's where people who matter celebrate milestones." I wanted her to feel important, and, foolishly, I thought making her feel important would finally make me feel loved. The room gleamed with amber light on polished wood. A live pianist played standards softly in the corner. I had arranged every detail. The imported wine she favored, the floral arrangements matching her navy dress, the custom cake from a pastry chef who charged more for one dessert than I spent on groceries in a week. 15 of her closest friends and colleagues were seated at the long table, their conversations rising and falling like practiced music. I had even chosen my outfit carefully. Subtle gray dress, understated jewelry, nothing that could draw criticism. I wanted to disappear into competence, to be invisible except for the gesture itself. My gift lay wrapped in Tiffany blue, a diamond bracelet I had saved for all year, at the expense of every indulgence. I had convinced myself it was the bridge between us, the proof that I valued her as she always demanded. For a while it worked. Mom was radiant, accepting compliments, laughing in a way that felt like sunlight cracking through a storm cloud. I caught myself hoping, dangerous, reckless hoping, that this night might shift the narrative of our lives. Each toast built the illusion. Her boss praised her precision. Her sister recalled childhood adventures. Her best friend thanked her for decades of loyalty. I sat, heart in my throat, waiting to be seen. Then she rose, glass in hand, posture flawless, eyes scanning the table before locking on mine. The pianist's hands hesitated over the keys, sensing the air change. "You know what would be the best birthday gift," she said, smile serene. "If Avery would finally leave my life." The silence was brutal. Forks froze midair. Someone coughed, then swallowed it down. 15 pairs of eyes turned to me, measuring my reaction. My chest burned. I couldn't breathe. She wasn't finished. 34 years of mediocre choices, she continued, voice steady. A career built on luck, no husband, no children, still depending on me for a roof. Tell me, what parent would call that success? Her words landed like blows. A friend of hers tried to laugh it off, saying, "Evelyn, you don't mean that." But Mom lifted her glass higher. I've never been more serious. The room chilled by 20 degrees. The cake sat untouched, its gold leaf decoration mocking the wreckage of the night. I felt humiliated, gutted, but also strangely clear. It wasn't just the cruelty of the moment. It was the culmination of decades. The diaries she had read without remorse, the partners she had driven away, the money she had siphoned, the endless comparisons to other people's children. And now, in front of everyone who mattered to her, she had stripped me bare and declared me disposable. I didn't cry. I didn't speak. I memorized the way she looked at me, calm, certain, superior, as though she had just delivered a truth the world had been waiting to hear. I knew then that this wasn't only about me being unworthy. It was about power, and for the first time, I decided I would no longer give her any. The evening dissolved in awkward goodbyes. Guests left early, offering half-hearted pats on my shoulder, murmuring, "Hang in there." I drove her home in silence, gripping the steering wheel until my knuckles ached. She checked her phone, unaffected, as though the bomb she had dropped was nothing more than small talk. When we reached the house, she went upstairs without a word, leaving me alone in the kitchen with the untouched remains of the cake and the echo of her declaration still ringing in my ears. It should have ended there, a night of cruelty filed alongside the 1,000 other smaller wounds. But this time something shifted, because when she said she wanted me gone, I realized she had just given me permission to take everything she held dear and place it firmly out of her reach. And that was exactly what I intended to do. That night, lying in my childhood bedroom beneath the same slanted ceiling I had stared at for decades, her words looped endlessly. If Avery would finally leave my life, they echoed louder than the traffic outside, louder than the creaks of the old maple brushing against the window. I pressed my pillow over my ears, but you can't muffle what's inside your chest. I had lived under her shadow for so long that humiliation felt like an old acquaintance. But this time was different. This wasn't a private correction, whispered behind closed doors. This was a public execution of my worth. She had taken every guest, every friend, every relative, and handed them a story. That I was the disappointment, the dead weight, the daughter unworthy of love. The shame was physical. My skin prickled, as if I were still seated at that table, the weight of 15 stares pressing down. I replayed the moment over and over, wondering what I could have said, what sharp line, what witty retort might have saved me from looking small. Instead, I had sat frozen, and now the silence felt like complicity. I thought of the bracelet tucked back into its Tiffany box, hidden in my bag. Months of sacrifice, of skipping meals, of denying myself warmth and softness, all so I could give her a token of my devotion. And she had given me, in return, the ultimate rejection. I wanted to hurl that box into the river, to watch it sink out of sight, like every attempt I'd ever made to please her. But beneath the humiliation was something sharper. Anger. A deep, primal rage that pulsed hotter the longer I lay awake. Rage at the years she had stolen from me, years of doubting my talent, of policing my friendships, of twisting my victories into failures. Rage that I had built my entire adult life around trying to win her nod of approval, only to realize she had never intended to give it. For the first time, I saw the pattern clearly. Every sacrifice I had made, every compromise, had been placed on an altar to a God who would never bless me. And suddenly I felt hollowed out, like someone who had worshipped a false idol and woken up to ruins. In the days that followed, I drifted through life like a ghost. At the grocery store, I caught myself staring at the cereal aisle for 10 minutes, unable to choose. At my desk, I opened design files but couldn't focus, the colors blurring until they meant nothing. Friends texted, and I lied, saying I was busy. I couldn't tell them that I wasn't busy, I was unraveling. The worst moments were in the house itself. Every corner whispered memories of her control. The kitchen table where she had once scolded me for playing artist instead of applying for law school. The hallway where she had read my diary aloud, laughing at my teenage crush. The living room where she had compared me to everyone but myself. The house was supposed to be half mine. Dad had made sure of that, but it felt like a museum to my failures. I thought about leaving, disappearing into some cheap studio apartment where at least the silence would be my own. But the thought of abandoning the only thing Dad had left me, the house, the inheritance, the chance at stability, was unbearable. And that's when the realization struck. If I left, she would win. She would sit in that house. In the kitchen she had renovated with my inheritance, and believed she had driven me out for good. I couldn't allow that. Not anymore. It wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about reclaiming my life from someone who had never intended to give it back. And though the thought terrified me, there was also a spark of something unfamiliar: freedom. The morning after her birthday, I came downstairs to find my mother in the kitchen, calmly spooning yogurt into a bowl, as if she hadn't detonated my life 12 hours earlier. She didn't acknowledge the wreckage she had left behind. She never did. "Is there coffee?" she asked, flipping the newspaper without looking at me. Something inside me snapped. For 34 years, I had been trained to shrink, to smooth things over, to wait for scraps of approval. But that morning I wasn't shrinking. I was calculating. If she wanted me out of her life, fine. But it would be on my terms, not hers. I reached out to Nicole, my oldest friend from college, who also happened to be a family attorney. When I poured out the story of the dinner, her expression shifted from sympathy to steel. "Avery," she said, "your fathers will give you equal rights to the house. If either of you leaves, it defaults entirely to the one who stays." She handed you the opportunity herself. Her words lit a fire in me. For the first time, I saw a way forward, not as a victim, but as someone who could rewrite the rules. Over the next week, Nicole guided me through every step. We froze the joint bank account after discovering my mother had siphoned thousands into her personal account over the years. A private investigator confirmed she had stashed more than $200,000 in a hidden fund, money that should have been half mine. Then came the locks. With documentation in hand, I hired a locksmith to change every one of them. I installed security cameras, set up alerts, prepared for the inevitable confrontation. When she came home that night, shopping bags in hand, her key jammed in the door. I stood inside, heart pounding, as she pounded on the wood. "Open this door. This is my house." I steadied my voice. "It's my house too. You said you wanted me gone. I've decided it's you who has to leave." She called the police, of course. When they arrived, she wept, portraying herself as the devoted mother abandoned by an ungrateful child. But I presented the will, the bank statements, even a recording of her birthday declaration. The officers exchanged glances. "Ma'am," one said gently to her, "this is a civil matter. She has every right to be here." For the first time, the law was on my side. And for the first time, she had no control. The battle escalated. She smeared my name to relatives, to clients, even showing up at my office to cause a scene. I responded with evidence, calm explanations, and, finally, a restraining order. When the judge reviewed the case, she saw through my mother's performance. Evelyn's mask slipped in the courtroom. Her rage boiled over as she screamed that I was weak, ungrateful, doomed to fail. That outburst sealed the verdict. The house was awarded solely to me. She was ordered to return nearly $175,000 of my inheritance. And yet, that wasn't the final twist. A week after the ruling, I discovered something I hadn't expected. My mother had already prepared to sell the house quietly, transferring documents to a buyer through a shady broker. Had she succeeded, I would have been left with nothing. Nicole and the investigator unearthed the attempt just in time, and when I confronted her, she snarled, "I will ruin you before I let you in." But here's the truth. She had already lost. She lost the moment I stopped begging for her approval and began building boundaries instead. She lost when her cruelty became evidence against her. She lost when I finally realized that freedom was worth more than her version of love. The house, once a cage, became mine to reclaim. I painted the walls colors she would have hated: burnt orange, seafoam, daring teal. Each brushstroke felt like peeling her fingerprints off my life. My design business, battered by her smear campaign, rebounded as loyal clients spread the word about my resilience. And slowly, painfully, I began to believe I could exist without her judgment defining me. The greatest twist wasn't legal or financial. It was emotional, because the gift she demanded, that I leave her life, came true, but in reverse. It was she who packed her bags, she who drove away, she who now tells anyone who will listen that her daughter betrayed her. And me, I didn't just survive. I took back everything she thought I wasn't worthy of. 18 months have passed since that night on the river, and the silence inside this house no longer feels like punishment. It feels like air. The maple tree outside my window drops its leaves just as it always has. But now I rake them without hearing criticism over the blisters on my palms. The kitchen still hums with the refrigerator my father once stocked with late-night ice cream, but the counters gleam under colors I chose, not ones imposed to impress company. I sometimes catch myself wondering if my mother ever sits in her new apartment and replays that night the way I do. But then I remind myself it doesn't matter, because the power she held over me is gone. She demanded that I leave her life. In the end, I gave her exactly what she wanted, and more. I removed her from mine. My story isn't neat, and it isn't easy, but it is mine. And that, after decades of living as a footnote in someone else's script, is victory enough. What about you? If you had been in my place, sitting at that table with the weight of those words crushing down, what would you have done? Would you have walked away or stood your ground? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And if this story resonated with you, if it reminded you of battles you fought in silence, please subscribe. Your voice, your presence, your story matters here. Together,